here we're going to talk about how to dissect an MBE question. So instead of answering just 100 questions a day really quickly, you want to start by answering them slowly and methodically. Learn how to dissect them. Learn the right technique. If you do this, you're going to start to see your MBE score improving much more quickly with much less effort on your part. And that's the goal. Okay, it's like, let's say you wanted to get good at painting and you had 100 canvases. One way you could approach it is just by painting all 100. By the time you get to canvas number 100, hopefully your painting would look better than it did at canvas number 1. Okay? But another way to approach it is to start with canvas 1 and try to learn the technique, okay? Figure out something about lighting or brush strokes or whatever. I don't know anything about painting. But in the beginning, slow down and really try to learn the technique and then gradually speed up. If you use that technique, by the time you got to canvas 100, your painting would look great compared to canvas number 1. All right, and you would see fast improvement because you actually took the time to learn the techniques before you started to speed up. And that's the same approach with MBE questions. One thing you could do is just answer 100 questions a day and hope your score improves. And it would inevitably, hopefully, improve a little bit. But the better way is to start out slow. Start with a slow and methodical approach. Dissect the question. Learn the strategy. Learn how to recognize certain facts in a fact pattern or what the call to the question is actually asking. And then you're going to get better at it. It's going to become part of your muscle memory. You'll naturally start to speed up. And by the time you start to answer more questions at once, you're going to see your score improving pretty significantly. That's the goal, at least. Okay, so I'm going to just basically walk through these steps, and then we're going to answer a question together using these steps. So step 1 is to read the fact pattern and the call to the question, then stop. I recommend, after answering 1 million MBE questions and teaching a bunch of students how to do this, I recommend that you just start with the top of the MBE question. So just start at the very beginning, read the facts, read the call to the question, and then stop. Some students will read the call to the question first, which is fine. If it works for you, you can do it, but I generally don't recommend that because oftentimes students will then try to anticipate the facts, or they won't read the fact pattern with a clear mind. Some students will read the answer choices before even reading the fact pattern. Please don't do that. That's a waste of time. That's an ineffective strategy. I would just recommend you start by starting with the top of the question and going down, stop at the call to the question. Next, identify the subject. Is it real property, evidence, torts? If you can't identify the subject, you probably need to spend more time in your outlines. Next, identify the legal issue being tested. What is it? A hearsay exception, character evidence, impeachment? What's the issue? Next, state the rule. All right, if it's something like business records exception, can you state all the elements? If you cannot state the elements of a business records exception, you need to spend more time memorizing your outlines. Next, answer the question without looking at the answer choices if possible. So when you're using the slow and methodical method, you get to the call to the question, cover up the answers, and see if you know what the answer choice is. All right, that's the goal. Sometimes it'll be impossible to do that. You'll just have to read the answer choices. But typically, for about 75% of the questions, you could try to anticipate what the correct answer choice is before even reading them. Next, find the correct answer choice. So find the one that matches what you said. And then lastly, go through the incorrect answer choices and explain why they're incorrect. If you use this strategy, then you're going to start to see improvement on your score. And you're going to stop doing things like second guessing yourself. Sometimes students are in between two answers and they always pick the wrong one. This is a great way to get out of those bad habits and start to see your score improve. So now let's look at an MBE question. Let's actually look at a problem together. So here I've put a criminal law MBE question on the screen. Let's read it together and then we'll talk about how to approach it. A man and his friend were drinking and playing pool in a busy hall. The man was bragging about how accurate of a hunter he was. The friend challenged him and expressed doubt at the man's accuracy. The man said that he was going to shoot the end of the pool stick that was across the room. The man promptly fired a shot at the pool stick. The bullet hit the pool stick but also ricocheted off the wall and struck and killed an elderly woman. What crime should the man be charged with? First-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, or no crime? All right, let's go through the steps and talk about how to dissect this MBE practice question. So step 1 is to read the fact pattern, then the call to question, then stop. Ideally, what you want to do is just pay close attention to the facts and then read the call to question, what crime should the man be charged with, and anticipate what the correct answer choice is. So this is not always possible, but the reason that we recommend you do this when you practice is because if you try to anticipate the correct answer before actually looking at the answer choices, first of all, you're likely to think through it in a more clear manner. And second of all, you're less likely to fall for traps or MBE tricks. Sometimes an answer choice will just look really good, or someone will become automatically attracted to a certain answer choice, even though if they would have thought through it ahead of time, they would not have arrived at that answer. So it's a really good habit to get into when you practice. So let's say that we read the facts and then we read the call to question, what crime should the man be charged with? Then we stop. The second step is to identify the subject. Here, the subject that's being tested is criminal law. If you find that you have trouble identifying the subject, first, make sure that you're using actual official released questions, because these actual released questions are well written and you should not have any trouble identifying the subject. If you do, it's a sign that you need to learn the law better. Okay, next is to identify the legal issue being tested. If it's really not readily apparent, then look at the call of the question. The call to question in this case tells us to focus on the crime that the man should be charged with, and we see in the fact pattern that the victim of the crime died. So the issue is whether the man committed homicide or not, and if so, what type. So again, if you have trouble with the issue, go right to the call to question and then use facts to cue you into what the legal issue might be. The next step is to state the legal rule. So when you practice MBE questions, I would make it a point to try to literally write out the rule, especially when you're first starting. Now, obviously, you don't want to do this on the exam. It'll take up way too much time, but it's a great habit to get into when you're practicing questions slowly and methodically, because first, you're going to be able to test yourself and see if you actually know the rule. So it's a great way to kind of actively quiz yourself. And second of all, if you don't know the rule, you can find it in your outline and you'll be able to better remember the rule because you've actively been looking for it and trying to think of what it is. So it's a really good way to actually learn the law if you don't know it. And if you do know it, it'll cement the law in your head so that you'll remember it for MBE day. So here the issue is common law homicide, and basically we have to determine if this guy is going to be guilty of murder or manslaughter, and if so, which degree or type. It's very important to know homicide for the MBE because there are going to be 3 or 4 scored MBE questions on homicide alone. So the examiners expect you to know these rules pretty well. So murder is defined as causing the death of another human being with malice aforethought, and there are 2 degrees, first-degree murder and second-degree murder. First-degree murder is an intentional killing that requires both premeditation and deliberation. So this means that the defendant has premeditated and deliberated. A classic example is a guy poisoning his wife or something like that. Basically, anything that you'd see in forensics files is usually typically first-degree murder because the defendant premeditates and deliberates. For second-degree murder, there are 3 mindsets that will satisfy the malice aforethought requirement. First is intent to cause grievous bodily harm and the person ends up dying. Like let's say the defendant wants to chop off someone's arm and they end up dying. He didn't want to kill them, but they end up dying. That would be second-degree murder. Second, extreme recklessness regarding homicidal risk and someone dies. Sometimes you see drunk driving examples, like a defendant will drive and he's way over the legal limit in terms of how much alcohol he's consumed, and he ends up hitting a pedestrian and they die. That could be considered extremely reckless and subject to second-degree murder. And third is catch-all. So it's the default whenever something is technically murder, but not first-degree murder. All right, so those are the 2 degrees of murder. Next, we have to ask, is voluntary manslaughter or involuntary manslaughter appropriate? So again, you want to know the rules. Voluntary manslaughter is the intentional killing of a human being without malice aforethought, committed in the heat of passion due to adequate provocation. The key words here are heat of passion and adequate provocation. Those are the ones that you really want to remember for this. A classic example of this is a guy finding his spouse in bed with another person and he ends up killing one or both of them. Then typically that would be subject to a voluntary manslaughter charge. Another example, which you'll see on the MBE, is let's say a defendant is punched in the face and he's really angry and he ends up taking out his gun and shooting the guy who punched him. That would be a classic example of voluntary manslaughter, and that type of situation is heavily tested on the MBE. And the reason is he was acting in the heat of passion, he didn't have time to cool off, and subject to adequate provocation since he was punched in the face. Involuntary manslaughter is the killing of another human being due to gross negligence or killing during the commission of a misdemeanor or felony that doesn't qualify for felony murder. You may have read cases about this in law school, like let's say a parent does not take their child to the doctor even though their child has an obvious infection and their child ends up dying. The parent could be liable for gross negligence and could be charged with involuntary manslaughter. So keep in mind that these rules are important to memorize. You have to know the rules to be able to apply them. So undergoing this type of active review when you're reviewing questions slowly and methodically is crucial to making sure that you know the rules. Here is when you'll discover whether or not you actually know the rules, because if you can articulate them, great, you know them. If you cannot articulate them, then there's going to be some trouble for you when you try to apply the rules, and you're likely going to get tricked. The best way to avoid getting tricked is to make sure you actually have the rules memorized. The next step here is to answer the question without looking at the answer choices. Again, the best way to see whether or not you truly know and are able to apply the law is to see if you can figure out what the right answer choice is without even looking at your options. Again, this is something you want to do when you practice so that you get better at the skill of answering MBE questions. You might not necessarily do this on exam day where you've hopefully already mastered this skill so you're able to accurately answer the questions regardless of whether you look at the answer choices first. But here we're just talking about how to dissect an MBE question so that you can improve through practice. So to refresh your memory, the call to the question is, what crime should the man be charged with? So if we apply the rules that we talked about, here the man fired his gun in a busy pool hall that was crowded with people. Remember, he intended to hit the end of his pool stick across the room. So is he liable for first-degree murder? No, because he didn't have premeditation and deliberation. He wasn't intending to kill anybody. So therefore, first-degree murder is not applicable. Is he liable for second-degree murder? Here, he fired a gun in a busy pool hall. It's true he didn't intend to kill anybody, but this could be considered extremely reckless. So this would qualify as this depraved heart murder or second-degree murder. So therefore, he's probably liable for second-degree murder. Note that voluntary manslaughter probably isn't going to be applicable in this case because he wasn't acting in the heat of passion due to adequate provocation. And involuntary manslaughter isn't probably going to be applicable because this arises above just being grossly negligent. Here he was likely extremely reckless. So the best answer choice in this scenario is probably going to be second-degree murder. So the next step is to find the correct answer choice. So read the answer choices and select the one that best matches the conclusion that you have already reached. Here the answer choices are first-degree murder, second-degree murder, voluntary manslaughter, or no crime. B, or second-degree murder, is the correct answer. It perfectly states the conclusion that we've articulated, that the man did not intend to kill anyone, but the firing of a gun in a crowded pool hall is considered extremely reckless and led to the elderly woman's death. The next step is to review the incorrect answer choices. Believe it or not, sometimes you will change your mind even after going through this analysis, and that's okay, as long as you're changing your mind for a good reason. I used to change my mind sometimes because I'd say, oh, I forgot to take into account that fact. Or, oh, whoops, did I not read the fact pattern closely enough because I didn't see that fact in the fact pattern. So sometimes reviewing the incorrect answer choices will actually cause you to change your mind. If you change your mind just because you're like, I kind of like the sound of that better, you're probably not doing it for a good enough reason, and you're probably being tricked. Another reason that it's good to review the incorrect answer choices is because you'll become more confident in your answer. Once you review the other incorrect answer choices, you're going to say, yep, I actually am very confident that the answer choice is B in this case. So here, let's look at the incorrect answer choices. A, first-degree murder. This would be the right answer choice if the man had the intent to kill, illustrated by premeditation and deliberation, but he didn't. He intended to strike the end of his pool stick across the room, so therefore A is incorrect. Voluntary manslaughter, this would require some adequate provocation and the man to respond without cooling off. Here the man was just trying to show off and show how accurate of a shooter he was, so therefore voluntary manslaughter is not the correct answer. D, no crime. Since the man acted extremely recklessly and it resulted in death, he can be charged with second-degree murder, so this is incorrect. So again, keep in mind it's good to review the incorrect answer choices, especially when you're going through this slow and methodical method, because you will sometimes change your answer, and that's okay, as long as you're doing it for the right reasons. A couple more important MBE notes. An important next step is to write down what you don't know. So I recommend if you do not know the law or if you answer the MBE question incorrectly, then write that down on a separate notepad that you didn't know the law or why you answered the question wrong, and keep reviewing this notepad.
We talked about this already briefly. I just want to emphasize it. Some people say, oh, I got the answer choice wrong and I read through the answers and I understand why I got it wrong. And so now I won't get it wrong next time. But again, the problem is you're reviewing too much law. So if you just depend on remembering the law or remembering why you got something wrong and being able to recognize it next time, then you're probably giving yourself too much credit because you're not going to remember it if you're going through so much material in a day. So make sure that you're writing something down on a legal pad if you don't know it. Like if you forgot the elements of second-degree murder or first-degree murder, write them down and then keep reviewing this because that will turn your weakness into a strength. Don't just simply read the answer explanation. That's not enough. You're only halfway there. There are a lot of advantages to dissecting MBE questions like this. Remember, the goal is to actually improve through practice. So you're not necessarily going to use this exact method on MBE day. It would take too long to be writing down the rule and everything every time you come to a question. But this is a great method to use when you practice because it's the best way to see your score improve. Why is it so good? First, it will help you learn the rules. By challenging yourself to state the rule every time you see an MBE question, you're going to learn the rules much better. Second, it will keep you engaged. This is an active and organized way of approaching the MBE, so you're less likely to suffer from fatigue or lose your concentration. Third, you'll start to understand how MBE questions work. You could read theory about MBE questions all day or read strategy, but if you read them slowly and methodically, you'll begin to intuitively understand how they're written, how to approach them. It's kind of like getting it in your muscle memory. Next, you're going to find yourself getting tricked less often. Because you're using a step-by-step approach to the MBE, you'll avoid the common traps and red herrings that trick a lot of students. Next, you'll decrease stress and anxiety. Students who race through several MBE questions a day often never see any true score improvement. This leads to a vicious cycle of answering questions, feeling stressed out, then answering more questions and feeling even more stressed out. So by slowing down, you're actually going to see your score improve and your stress level will go down. And then it will also help you improve your timing. It probably seems counterintuitive, but by going through questions slowly and methodically, you'll become faster at them over time. Lastly, it's the best way to efficiently approach the MBE. You're not just going through the motions, you're going through an organized and methodical approach, which is a great way to spend your time. Remember, it's also important to do timed exams, so don't just only answer questions slowly and methodically. What I recommend, especially to students who struggle with timing, is if you're going to spend, let's say, 2 hours a day on MBE questions, spend your first hour like this and spend your second hour timing yourself. That way you get the best of both worlds. You're doing this slow and methodical approach, which will help you improve over time, but you're also timing yourself so that you become aware of how long you actually have to answer each MBE question on exam day.